This is another episode of Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. And now the architects, Doug Patt and Stephen Chung.
So, Stephen, what are we going to call our show today?
Does size matter?
Does size matter? That's a really provocative title. I like that.
Alrighty, you are watching or listening to the Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. I'm Steve, and that is Doug, and we're going to talk about does size matter in your home?
Well, for most of us, probably should. So, Stephen, we're going to talk about the size of what today?
Size of your dream home. What
size
is the right
of
size?
Your dream home.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, it's interesting because we talk about size, it's always square footage.
Yes.
And I don't think that's necessarily the only metric that one should consider. If you've got 20-foot ceilings and you've got 1,000 square feet, somehow you have a lot more volume than someone that's got a 10-foot ceiling or an 8-foot ceiling.
Well said.
And yet it's the same as far as, let's say, a real estate listing goes. So I think size is often overemphasized, and we're going to talk about it.
Come
on, Doug, grow up.
So let's talk about house size today. How about my first tip? Should I just get rolling?
Yes. Get into your tip.
Okay. Tip number one. Now,
even tip sounds kind of bad now, doesn't it?
You and I discussed these things very briefly, like an email shot back and forth, and so on occasion, we're probably gonna not have or not be covering the exact same things. Hopefully, every once in a while, it gets a little duplicative, but I think that I've come up with some pretty original stuff here. So my tip number one is make sure your kitchen is large enough. So I've got an interesting story here. There's a local couple. They built a really cool kind of transitionally styled home in between contemporary and traditional. And I was an architect I was unfamiliar with. Anyway, I met them and I said, hey, look, I would love to see your house. Can I come over? And so they invited me over to the house, went through the whole thing. It was very pretty, but the one interesting aspect that really stuck with me happened to be their kitchen. We walked into the kitchen, and I'm telling you, it was like 10 feet square. It was super tiny. It's a very big house. It had this tiny kitchen. I didn't say anything. The owner turned and looked at me. He said, look, funny story. The house we lived in together previous to this one had a very large kitchen. And whenever we had parties, everybody congregated in the kitchen. And so we wanted to forego that baloney. We got really tired of everybody standing around in the kitchen. So we purposefully designed this really small kitchen in this very large house. They have a wonderful family room kind of off to the side. And we did that purposefully. So nobody would congregate in the kitchen. And guess what? We have parties and everybody is in the kitchen. Like, it's worse now than it's ever been. So I heard that story and I thought, oh my gosh, that it's just so true. That is our experience as well. We bought an old home from 1960s. The kitchen was literally about 10 feet square. No room for even an island in the center. We would have parties and people would just all work their way into the kitchen, and you'd have side by side people standing all the way around the interior. So I'd say my first tip is, even though you may want it to be smaller, you don't like that when you entertain, people end up in the kitchen. It really is, at least in my experience, where everybody goes when you're entertaining. And so you've got to have a kitchen that works with not only your wife and yourself and your kids or your family, but when people come over, where are they going to sit and how are you going to talk and have discussions? It's definitely something to think about. So make sure your kitchen is large enough. That's my first tip. Okay,
good tip. Alrighty, I'm going to just back up a little bit and just talk more generally. There was a show on HGTV that I used to watch a long time ago called House Hunters. Actually, I liked the House Hunters International because it was one of those escape shows, trying to buy a house in Europe or something like that. So it was always interesting. But so I would watch that show, and especially when they were in the U.S., they would follow a couple around and they would go into the first house, and I would try to guess what they would say. And they would say, this is really big. Then they cut to the next scene where they go into the bedroom. Oh, this is small. This is small. Go to the next room. This is big. This is it. It's just about the size. There's really nothing else. I mean, you can't blame them, right? They're not architects or designers, but this is really all they were talking about, was whether it was big or small. And I was kind of surprised that, is that all they know? Is that all they care about, whether the space is big or small? So anyway, my first tip is be aware of what is around, but don't let it consume you. So what it means is, let's say you're looking for a house, and people typically start with a website like Zillow. And Zillow gives you all these facts about size and square footage, and then it's about, how much are you paying for the house per square foot, and everything has to do with per square foot. It seems that's the magic number. And if somehow, let's say the house is a little bit smaller, but it's everything you want, it looks fantastic, this and that. Oh, but it's the square foot is, it's too high for the square foot for that area. Somehow people get paralyzed by this square foot thing, and they think that they need a 4,000 square foot house. Where did that come from? Why 4,000? All the other houses seem to be about 4,000. Does that fit your family need? Do you even know does that work? Is that what you're looking for? It doesn't seem to matter. They just sort of think that, well, I look at the Zillow thing and all the houses are 4,000 square feet, so I should probably get 4,000 square feet. So now you're being paralyzed by these dimensions, and whether that house is the right house for you, or it's the right dream house, or in the case you're building a house, do you really need to try to build a house that's 4,000 square feet because of why? Some broker is telling you for resale value you need to follow a certain square footage. So on the other hand, there's an experience I had a long time ago when I was a student, and a professor of mine built a house, 1,400 square feet, one bedroom, $1.7 million in the early 90s. So that's well over $1,000 a square foot, a one bedroom house that they could never, ever hope to resell unless some crazy architecture fanatic would want to buy this house. It was called a tea house. It was a big steel T on a mountain. Amazing architectural object, but if one is looking at Zillow, it probably does not do so well in Zillow, because it's like one bedroom for this much at this square footage. It doesn't quite work. I think you really have to figure out what you're looking for in your dream home. Is it about living somewhere temporarily while you think about how it's going to resell, or how you're going to resell it? If that's the thought, then you're kind of working at odds with yourself to a certain respect. I mean, is it really your dream house if you have to think about the next family who it's for? I think you really have to sort of figure out, am I going to be here for a long time? Maybe instead of 4,000, I can get away with 3,000 or 3,500. I think you really have to sort of figure out and sit down, what is it you're looking for? What is it that's going to work for you? What is your dream house? Figure how important this whole resale Zillow world is. I mean, maybe a one bedroom house in a 4-bedroom community is extreme. Maybe you could do 3. It's a little less than what's around, but it's sort of within the general, let's say, area. So you're kind of aware of what's around, but you're not so extreme that, let's say in the case that you really don't want to move, but for some reason you have to move, a job, a transfer, if something happens, then at least you can sell the property. But you don't want to let that resale thing kind of take over your life, or take over what you're looking for in your dream home. So I think it's a very in-depth kind of discussion and consideration between your family and what is it you're looking for in your dream home. Be aware of what's around, but don't let it consume you.
When your comment about talking about what's around you, I actually think about neighborhoods relative to highways, busy streets. Mm-hmm. And many times for people, those things, although they're drawbacks, when they're looking at the home, they move in, it really isn't an issue as well, or it becomes a really big problem. So anyway, just interesting, kind of piggybacking on your comment about square footage, which of course, that's the paradigm that everybody uses, but it's probably not the right one. So right. I agree. Okay, so tip number 2, consider making your family room part of your kitchen. So this may be very obvious to some people because that's the way homes are designed today, whereas other people don't ever really think about it. So my wife and I used to love watching the Osbournes on television. You remember this with Ozzy Osbourne and his wife? And so a lot of that show was shot in their kitchen/family room. So the camera would show their kitchen in the background, and then they had a big couch and some tables, and everybody was in that room all the time. And my wife and I used to say to ourselves, gosh, that looks like such a comfortable space. And when you look back at the aesthetics, all the decor. It's awful. However, it was popular back then. But the space was really wonderful. My wife and I happen to have a family room, which is set right next to this tiny kitchen. And when my daughter would be sitting in her high chair, our first daughter, eating in the other room, and I was cooking and Susan was at work or something, I'd always be thinking, oh my God, what if the kid is choking, in the other room? You couldn't see anything because the doorway was so far away from the kitchen. Anyway, we eventually renovated the kitchen and we took out that wall. Now we've got a space which is about 13 and a half, 14 feet wide by about 27 feet deep. And our kitchen and our family room fit in that space. And there's even a TV in there. And we absolutely love it. I've been to many homes that we've renovated with people who have done exactly the same. And we've even designed some homes where we're putting those two spaces together. So my point here is, you don't need a gigantic space for a kitchen family room to work or be functional in any way. We entertain a lot here, and we'll have, let's say, 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 people over, and we still all work in this little space. So even if your house isn't that big, it's something to definitely consider. It's very livable, and gosh, just with our little family here, it works really, really well. Kids will sit and do homework, or Susan will sit and do her bills at the kitchen island, and I can cook and we can watch TV, and it's a very, very functional space. So putting those two together, I've read a couple articles lately, saying that people are moving away from this open concept that we've been kind of into for the last 50 or 60 years, but I don't see that happening. I see people really enjoying living that way, and putting walls up and is probably, I wouldn't think, the direction that most residential construction will go, at least in the near future.
Okay, my second tip has to do with cost. And this is the case if you're going to design and build your dream home. Surprise, surprise, if it's smaller, it's less costly. Right, Doug?
Yes. Not.
And hey, look, when we talk about, again, size, people often talk about, square foot, and I'm thinking about volume. Smaller volume is less costly. It's less costly to build. It's less costly to maintain. It's less costly on your taxes. It's less costly on utilities. So let's say that you are someone like our producer who's a younger guy and has a wife and a young kid, and maybe they want to have 3 kids, but they have 1 right now and they want to spend X. Why build a 4,000 or 5,000 square foot house, which might be great and when they have 5 kids, but right now they have 1? Maybe there's a way to design and build your house so that it is the right size for now, but has the flexibility that it can expand very easily. Now that requires some good work, some good thinking with your architect or your builder, or hopefully your architect and builder and homeowner, and you can really think about how this house can grow to accommodate a growing family. And perhaps over time, let's say that husband and wife are making more money, they have more money, they have a bigger family, they can put it back into the house, on and on and on. But buying a big house or designing and building a house when they have the small family, the idea for the future, and again, for the future parties that they'll have, and if all these things having to do with later on, maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think build the right size for where you are, but I think some really thoughtful planning. And I think if we go back to our last episode on basements, for example, having a walkout basement, which is perhaps not finished, let's say when you first design the house, but could clearly and easily become a family room later on, or a TV room. That can be a space that you can quickly sort of take over easily without a lot of cost. Perhaps there's a way to extend off one wing, a future family room easily, if one's thinking very carefully and planning ahead. So I would say if you're going to design and build a house for yourself, build it smaller and think about how you might want to expand. Hey, you may never want to expand. It might be the right size. And let's say it's even smaller than what's around the neighborhood, and let's say you do have to sell for some reason, and let's say the house is 3,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet, and most of the houses are 1,000 square foot more. Well, maybe it doesn't sell as high as the other houses, but I think that maybe some family will want to live in that neighborhood just because it's a great neighborhood, right? Or that house has some expansion possibilities, and maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more for all of those different reasons. So you don't always have to build what's around you. I think probably build what's best for you, and I think that there can be different plans for expansion and having something that's flexible that can accommodate your family as it grows or doesn't grow. Maybe it actually contracts.
Unfortunately, let's hope not. That's a great tip. In fact, I'm going to piggyback on that, and I'll try not to repeat any information. But I was thinking about exactly the same thing when my wife and I moved back to Pennsylvania about 20 years ago. We got to see this property, and it was about 2.5 acres, and it had a small home on it, smallest home in the neighborhood. And the first thing my father said to me was, if you buy this, be prepared to spend an absolute fortune taking care of the property. It had lots and lots of trees, and he said, trees are really expensive. And I completely ignored him. I was like, yeah, totally not a big deal. I'll get a chainsaw and we'll get it all worked out. Well, let me tell you, we've been here quite some time, and I've lost over, let's say it's 22, 23 very large trees on this property. Very, very expensive. So it kind of brings me to my point. It's about house size or size in general for any of these things. The larger your home, the larger your property, the more money you're going to spend on it. So the upside to having a property like this is that it's the least expensive home in the neighborhood. So you never want to own the castle of the neighborhood. You always want to own the house that's least expensive, because at the end of the day, all the other homes are going to bring the price of your home up, hopefully. So that, at least the little bit that I know about real estate, relatively or should typically hold true. But anyway, when you think about building a home, you want to think about materials. And if you're using natural materials, let's say you're using a wood veneer, you got to think about the fact that you're painting that house every 5 to 10 years, if you're lucky. So the larger the home, the more expensive it is. And that's just the way it works. And when you step outside, all of those landscape features cost money too. They cost money to clean. It costs money to replace. If you live in the Northeast, you're going to get snow. Snow removal is very expensive. And of course, you're paying for somebody to cut your lawn. If my lawn is simply too big for me to cut, I'd be out there for way longer than it pays for me to be out there cutting a lawn. So I've got to have somebody come and take care of that for me. So size really does matter when it comes to long-term, how much money you're spending on not only the property, but your home. And that's not something I'd ever really thought about. But as I get older and I think about saving money and where I'm going to be in 10 or 15 or 20 years, is it going to be this house or another house? Having that maintenance cost on a yearly basis can be quite challenging. That's, of course, why people end up going to over 55 and over 65 communities, because they can diminish those costs considerably and retire. So long-term costs, consider what your long-term expenditures are going to be with a larger home. Tip number 3.
Yep, exactly right. Okay, so my third tip has kind of touches on some of the things you talked about with room sizes, and it has to do with becoming familiar with room sizes, but also dimensions. And let me explain. So dimensions, orientation. Let me explain. So I think that you have to become very familiar with your current house, the sizes of the rooms that you have. When one is often planning for a house, it takes a while, it takes time. People often spend a lot of time cutting images or clipping images or saving images, let's say, on different websites now. Those often have to do with ideas, concepts, materials, looks, let's say, styles, but not often the size. And you really have to become familiar with the size. What is the right size for a kitchen? And you had mentioned some ideas about that, or a dining room or a family room. What is the right size? Not just it should be 25 by 25 because that's gigantic. Well, is that the right size really? Is it you're just throwing out a number? And not only that, let's say you want a bedroom and it's 12 by 12. Where did that 12 by 12 come from? What about, let's say 12 by 12 is 144 square feet. What about 10 by 14? That's actually less square footage, but is that a better orientation? It's a smaller size. Is it a better orientation for a bedroom? Do you know? You should know, right? You should have a really good feeling for that. And let's say that 10 by 14 room has large windows on either side, which now completely changes the perception of the space. So let's say the 12 by 12 has 3 windows, but they're like little windows on all 3 sides. What does that feel like relative to the 10 by 14 with the 2 big windows on 2 sides? So the 12 by 12 is more square footage. It's got 3 windows, and yet maybe it feels smaller than the 10 by 14 with 2 windows. I think really have to become familiar with the size, the orientation, the dimensions. Now let's take that same room, 12 by 14 or 10 by 14, and make the ceiling 9 feet as opposed to 8 feet. What does that feel like? Again, in square footage price, in Zillow world, 10 by 14 is less square footage. Is it better? Is it worse than the 12 by 12? So I think this is where you really have to sort of try to evaluate and go beyond this real estate square footage is the way that we measure the quality of a space. And it really has to be a much more in-depth kind of study. And so that's why you have an architect that we, for both of us, I think we're certainly drawing in plan and elevation. We have a very good feeling for it. But I build computer models and like to look at spaces in 3D and really get a good feeling for a space. And something that maybe feels or seems small in plan actually feels great just because of its, let's say, connection or its adjacency to, as you say, the open family room to the kitchen, and maybe that space. If you take the two rooms side by side and think, oh, they're both kind of small, put them together and they feel fantastic. So I think it really has to be, you really have to try very hard to become familiar with room sizes, orientations, and have your architect help you with that. Really try to understand what you need, what is going to work, what's optimal. Find the right size for what your needs are.
One thing to add to that is furniture, drawing the furniture and plans. So Joe talks about this all the time. So we'll be in schematic design and we'll have the plan laid out, and he goes bananas about making sure that we're showing the right furniture in those spaces, because you get a way better sense for how they're going to function. That's not something that's taught in school. I mean, I don't remember anybody, it might be taught in interior design school, but nobody ever sat me down and said, look, 18 inches is optimal from the face of the couch to the coffee table. Those are really important dimensions, and you need to have a handle on that. So make sure if you're designing your home or you're an architect is, hey, please put images or put the plan drawings of furniture in those spaces so we get better sense. And I always tell, if we're going to be renovating spaces, I always tell the owner, get a sense for what you're going to buy, and then let me know, send me the cut sheets, and I'll throw the furniture into the room and we'll make sure that everything works perfectly. So anyway, very good point. Great tip.
It's very funny that I often, now that I just give the advice, I think about, oh, let me draw a water closet room, a toilet room, and I think, okay, I'll make it 3.6 wide. Maybe I'll make it 3.9 or 4. It's got to be 6'6". Probably I'll make it 7. Like, you and I have these dimensions, like they're just in our heads because we've been doing them so often. I almost don't think about them. For a homeowner that hasn't really thought in that level of detail, I mean, certainly an architect can help, but I mean, that's kind of the level of, over time, you just become very familiar with, let's say, certain dimensions, what you sort of need, what would be considered a little bit more luxurious or a little bit more expansive. And there are certain dimensions that just don't make any sense. I mean, maybe it's really big, but let's say a bedroom is 20 by 20. And the bed is here, and the TV is like 30 feet way down over there. And how are you going to furnish that room, as you say? It just doesn't make any sense. It's like, it's big, but I can't even, the dimensions are nonsensical. So again, be familiar with the room sizes. Alrighty, Doug, we actually have a question. It's from our producer.
Sweet.
I kind of made it, took out his name to protect him.
Give it to me.
Okay. My wife and I talk about our dream home fairly often. Now that she's looking into a permanent job, we are talking about where to live and what size the house is right for our family. We were both into the whole minimalist thing for a while, but would like to have some place or some space for our own offices or rooms to have guests stay, etc. Anyway, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the topic. So that just goes back to the entire topic, right? So what would you say, Doug? How would you help our producer here?
Oh my gosh. Thinking about so many things. The market currently is really interesting for prefabricated contemporary homes. I've been on a couple websites, and they're small. So if I were somebody that had a little bit of money, and I wanted to build my dream home, and I've said this before, I will never design my own home because it'll take forever and I'll never stop. But I'm sure I could find a really cool design that somebody else has created that I'd be super happy with. So I check out these websites because it's prefab, so it's going to cost less. Okay, well, let's hope it costs a little bit less, or they're doing something wrong, or they're not going to stay in business forever. But I've seen some of these houses, and they're really, really cool. So we're not talking about tiny homes here, which is a whole different ballgame. I mean, you got to be really close with whoever you're going to be living in there with, and ready for really tight quarters for a long time. I think getting one of these smaller prefabricated contemporary homes, find a great piece of property, and go for it. That's the first thing that I would recommend. Nobody needs a big house. You just don't need. I've got a decent sized home, and I walk through the house, and half the house I'm never in. So I just, unless it's really important to you for other people to see how big your home is and have all of these large spaces for all your stuff, and that's important to you, I don't think having a big home is a great thing. And in fact, many of the wealthy clients that we work with today are coming to us and saying the same thing. This is going to be a smaller house. We don't need it to be big. And houses are getting smaller. Probably has something to do with public perception, and also has to do with changing paradigm. So I'm sure I didn't answer his question, but that's where I'm at on homes and sizes.
My thought, okay, so if this is a new home, I would first find a location that has, let's see what they're looking for. It has to do with maybe proximity to work. It has to do with the school system. It has to do with all of those sorts of things. I would find a neighborhood that they like for whatever reason. And then I would try to find a property like your house, right? Kind of the least expensive, or let's say something that can be torn down or needs a lot of work or what have you. So when you're entering into that neighborhood, you're sort of down at the lower end of it. And now whatever improvements you make, when you're done, you're still not exceeding, let's say, the most expensive that's there. And when we talk about improvements, I would try to find the house that is right for you now, and perhaps maybe with one more person. So let's say it's 3 or 4. But let's say their plan is to have 6. I would still design and work with the plan that let's design for kind of now and a tiny bit more, and then build into it some flexibility. Prefab may be one way to go. I'm finding actually the cost prefab is not always as advertised. Okay. It's another subject. We should get into it. But if you look at sort of local knowledge, let's say local stick built, you can often find it very comparable to something which is coming from far away because of transportation, and there's different reasons. Plus, you want to modify it. But if you're building a custom home, something for you that needs to be flexible or wants to be flexible, it may make the most sense to have a local builder. So you'll have to evaluate that. That's another subject. But I like the idea of building for what you need now and building into it flexibility, expansion capability or possibility. That's cool. So that's my thought.
An interesting idea. I like that.
Alrighty, Doug. So does size matter? Size matters. Yes, it does matter.
Yes, it does.
But it's not always about being bigger, I guess, right?
Right. It's not always about that. That's a very funny subject. All right. You've been watching or listening to Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.